Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Jonathan Maudsley. I am the Science Advisor at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. This webinar is one in a series of webinars that's presented on a monthly basis by the U.S. Forest Service Research and Development Program and the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies on topics that are of mutual interest to the Forest Service and to state fish and wildlife agencies. Today's webinar will be on the topic Ranchers and Beavers, Social Aspects of Beaver-related Watershed Restoration in Western Rangelands with Dr. Susan Charnley from the Pacific Northwest Research Station at the U.S. Forest Service, R&D. Before we get going on today's webinar, just a couple housekeeping announcements. First, the webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording with anyone who requests it. It's also going to be made available publicly on AFWA's YouTube channel, where you can go to YouTube and just type in Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies or AFWA. You'll find our YouTube channel. You'll find the recording for this as well as other webinars that we've had in this series and other webinars sponsored by the association. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. Another housekeeping announcement, we will be muting all of the lines except for the speakers' lines. So if you happen to have a question during the course of today's webinar, we ask that you type it in the chat box, which will appear in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And I'll be sending out little notices pinging you to ask if you have any questions during the webinar. And so please feel free to type questions there. When we go to Q&A, I'll read the questions that have come in the chat box. And then if we have time and as circumstances permit, we will open it up to more general questions from folks on the line. But I will be muting the lines after Monica finishes the introduction of today's speaker so that we can make sure that we don't have any extraneous noise on the background. So with that, that concludes our housekeeping portion of the conversation. We're very much looking forward to today's webinar. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our colleague Monica Thomasy at the Forest Service Research and Development, who will introduce today's speaker. Monica.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for this opportunity again to connect biologists and managers with some of the more work we do in Forest Service wildlife and fisheries and social science research programs for the wildlife and fish management community. Welcome, everyone. Through this AFWA webinar series, we are able to address many questions the state and other biologists have about scientific information on topics of current concern, who is doing which kinds of research, and information delivery efforts. Today's topic was requested given the growing need for objective information on the people part of the natural resource management equation. This is our first social science webinar, hopefully not our last. Every other one has been biologically based. So we're very happy to have Susan Charnley here. Susan is a research social scientist with the Pacific Northwest Research Station of the Forest Service in Portland, Oregon. She holds a PhD in anthropology from Stanford University. Susan's research investigates how to best achieve the dual goals of environmental conservation and rural community well-being. She is the co-author of the recently released book, Stitching the West Back Together. The other co-authors were Thomas Sheridan and Gary Nabhan. Most of her work takes place in the western United States and also in Africa. Thank you, Susan. Go right ahead.
Great. We're going to mute the lines.
The conference has been muted.
Hey, well, thanks.
And then bring Susan back up. Thank you, Susan.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here as the first social scientist to present in your webinar series. Jonathan, do you want to go to the first slide? Okay, so as mentioned, the topic for today is Ranchers and Beavers, the social aspects of beaver-related watershed restoration in Western Rangelands. As you may be aware, beaver-related watershed restoration strategies have been growing in popularity throughout the West in recent years, but the science needed to inform these restoration strategies and demonstrate whether or not they're achieving their desired outcomes is still lagging behind the growth and popularity of this approach. So as a result, over the past 2 years, the Department of Agriculture's Northwest Climate Hub and the Department of Interior's Northwest Climate Science Center have been funding an interagency, interdisciplinary team of scientists to look at both the biophysical as well as the social impacts of beaver-related watershed restoration and the conditions under which it may be an appropriate approach and can be effective. So that is to say that the research I'm going to be talking about today is being conducted under the auspices of a larger project that also includes other scientists who are looking at the impacts of beaver-related restoration on hydrology, on biodiversity, and on riparian vegetation. So going to the next slide, the issue that we're trying to address primarily is the problem of incised stream channels. That was what motivated this project in the first place. If you look at the photo on the right of this slide, you could see what an incised stream channel looks like. We don't really have, data that are mapping the extent of incised stream channels throughout the West, but they are quite common, and the focus of our work has been in the Great Basin and in rangeland areas, and so rangelands have quite a few incised streams. Stream incision happens when you get erosion and downcutting that results in disconnecting streams from their floodplains. Consequently, the vegetation on the floodplain dries out as the water table lowers, and this can have negative impacts, of course, on the riparian vegetation and also on the in-stream habitat for fish. So the problem of fish, of course, we have a number of threatened and endangered fish in our streams in the western U.S., and that's been another motivation to try to use beaver-related watershed restoration strategies to restore streams. We're also looking at ways to enhance riparian habitat for wildlife, and also there are concerns around drought and adaptation to drought, as climate models predict that the temperatures are going to get warmer, that we're not going to have as much precipitation from snow, and that we're more likely to have extended drought periods. How then can we help to retain water in our groundwater systems and in our watersheds? So these are the issues that beaver-related restoration strategies are trying to address. Going to the next slide, let me just say a word about what I mean by beaver-related restoration. There are a couple of different forms. One approach has to do with beavers themselves. The first approach is when you go out to a stream and you undertake practices to improve the vegetation in riparian areas so that you can have vegetation that would support beaver populations. So if you go out and do riparian restoration, then basically it's a build it and they will come approach. You may then have beavers naturally recolonizing the area and building their dams and then getting the positive effects of beaver dams on the landscape. So that's one approach. Another approach to using beaver is to translocate them, and beaver translocation has been somewhat widespread. There, in this strategy, you basically remove beavers from places where they're not wanted. Often these are nuisance beavers, and you move them to places where they are wanted so that you can get their beneficial ecological impacts. I'm actually not going to be talking about beaver translocation today. The other approach where you don't have habitat conditions that support beaver populations is to try and create those conditions by starting out by implementing artificial beaver dam-like structures. There's a variety of different kinds of artificial beaver dams. Oh no, sorry, my computer just went into power save mode, so I can't see the slides, but I'll fix that. Anyway, there's a variety of different kinds of beaver dam-like structures, and I'll be talking about some of those today as well. Okay, going to the next slide. So why beaver-related restoration as an approach as opposed to other forms of restoration for watersheds? Well, a number of scientists have been conducting research to try and document the impacts of beavers and beaver dams on local ecologies, and they've found that beavers can in fact help to reduce stream gradients and increase stream complexity, thereby reversing incision processes. That's because beaver dams capture sediment and organic matter that's flowing down those streams. Also, by doing this, by building the stream channel back up, you can alter riparian and floodplain vegetation, and that in turn can improve wildlife habitat. Beaver dams and the pools that form behind them and the complex stream channels that they help create have also been found to increase fish rearing habitat and to also create temperature refugia for fish, and so they can certainly have positive impacts on fish. And then it's also been documented that beaver dams help to increase groundwater storage and to raise water tables. That, in turn, can contribute to more permanent stream flows. So these are all some of the positive effects that have already been documented from beaver dams themselves. Beaver-related restoration is also a relatively low-cost approach. We call it a nature-based solution because it's using beavers and their dams or artificial dams built from local materials to try and undertake restoration. And so relative to some of the other approaches that are being used, it's believed to be fairly low cost. Now, these positive impacts on groundwater storage and on riparian habitat conditions can also be good for people. For example, for livestock production and potentially for irrigation activities. So that is why this is becoming an approach that is increasingly being adopted. If we go to the next slide, we can see to what extent beaver restoration has been occurring throughout the West. This is actually one of the first activities that we engaged in when we started this research project. We did an inventory of projects throughout the West that are using one of the forms of beaver-related restoration that I described earlier. And we found in late 2015 that there were 99 projects we could identify. If you look at the blank or the open circles, those represent translocation projects. If you look at the solid circles, those represent in-stream structures that have been put in. And so there are 79 beaver translocation projects and 13 in-stream structure projects that we documented in the fall of 2015. The circles with dots in them have both. All of these projects were carried out since the year 2000. So again, it's a recent approach. There's been a lot of beaver translocation. In-stream structures are relatively new, but they are growing in popularity. So next slide. The stakeholders that have been involved in this effort have been numerous. Fish and wildlife management agencies at both the federal and state levels have been involved in this kind of restoration. A number of regulatory agencies are involved because if you're going to put in-stream structures, there are regulatory processes surrounding that. A number of other local, state, and federal agencies have also played roles in helping to fund or helping to educate about this restoration approach, among other things. Public land managers have been engaged because a number of these projects have been occurring on public lands. Private landowners have also been involved because a number of projects also take place on private lands. And then environmental groups are interested, watershed councils are interested, university researchers are involved because they want to better understand the impacts of these approaches. So a number of stakeholders have been engaging. Well, going to the next slide. Let's ask the question, what does social science have to do with all of this? Well, I was asked, because this is your first social science webinar, to say a few things about what social science is. So social science, like natural science, is comprised of many different disciplines. We have anthropology, which is my field. We have sociology, political science, economics, psychology, human geography. All of these different social science fields ask slightly different questions and focus on different topics and sometimes use different kinds of methodological approaches. But basically, we're all interested in better understanding the social and cultural aspects of human behavior and its consequences at different times and places. Social science is science. We don't think of a distinction between soft science and hard science, although sometimes people think of social science as a soft science. We do test hypotheses, we do build theory, and we use both quantitative and qualitative methods. Going to the next slide, what then can social science bring to the field of environmental restoration? Well, a lot of the research that I do actually focuses on trying to improve our understanding of the social context in which different kinds of environmental management actions take place. I think that natural scientists do a great job in figuring out what kind of restoration approaches may be effective for achieving the kinds of environmental outcomes that we might want to see from environmental restoration. But if you think about where those environmental restoration approaches are going to be implemented, in the case of beaver-related restoration projects and rangelands, they're going to take place either on private lands, and those lands are tending to be owned by ranchers in places like the Great Basin, or they're going to take place on public lands where ranchers have public lands grazing allotments. So if you want to implement these restoration strategies in a way that's successful, you have to do it in a way that's going to be socially acceptable and economically feasible so that you don't have a lot of conflict, you don't have a lot of problems. So better understanding how to do it in a way that's more socially acceptable and more feasible from an economic standpoint is quite important. In the case of beaver-related restoration, as I mentioned earlier, because it often entails installing in-stream artificial structures, there's a complicated legal and regulatory framework surrounding that. And in fact, that's proved to be a barrier to this restoration approach in a number of different cases. And so we also need to better understand the regulatory and legal context for beaver-related restoration. And if it's something we decide we want to be able to do, we need to learn how to create a more enabling regulatory environment. And so social science can help to provide insight into how to make that happen as well. Okay, going to the next slide. I think certainly in the case of this project, the kind of questions that we're trying to answer: how does beaver-related restoration affect ranchers and livestock operations? How can ranchers manage livestock grazing in a manner that's compatible with watershed restoration? What restoration approaches are appropriate where, both from an ecological standpoint and from a social standpoint? What kinds of social and ecological trade-offs are associated with different types of restoration approaches? It's good to understand that to better inform decision making. And then again, how can we create a more enabling social environment that supports beaver-related restoration on both public and private lands? And that might vary a bit depending where you're doing it. Okay, finally, let's get on to the next slide and focus in then on the research questions that we asked in this particular research project. First of all, I'm going to talk today about what the social impacts of beavers and beaver-related restoration practices are on ranchers. And then second, what did we learn is needed to create a more enabling social environment for beaver-related restoration on western rangelands. The next slide describes the methods that we've been using for our research. We began by conducting a literature and document review on the questions of interest to us. We found that, in fact, very little research has been conducted to date on what ranchers think about beavers and beaver dams and how they affect their livestock operations. So I think we're contributing here to a large gap in the research. The second thing we did was we looked for case study sites where we could go and conduct field work that would entail talking to ranchers about what they thought about beavers and beaver-related restoration projects. So we tried using the project inventory that I described earlier. We tried to identify sites in the Great Basin in particular, which was our study area of interest, where different kinds of beaver-related restoration strategies had been tried, and they'd been tried either on private ranch lands or on public lands having grazing allotments. And ranchers were some of the primary stakeholders in these projects, so that we could go and, again, investigate how it was impacting them and their livestock operations. So we identified 5 different sites, and then we went to those sites and we conducted interviews using an interview guide with questions with ranchers who were involved in these projects. We were also interested in talking to neighbors of theirs in the watershed who may not have been directly involved in the projects, but they were affected by the projects. And we asked them a variety of questions about what they thought about this, what their experience was, what the impacts on them were, etc. But then we also conducted interviews with a number of different stakeholders who had been involved in these projects. And those numbers give you the sample size of people that we have interviewed to date. We're still actually doing some final interviews at some of our sites, so this is still a research project in process. And so the results that I'm going to describe today are basically our preliminary findings. Going to the next slide, you can see where our case study sites are located. We're working at 2 sites in Oregon that span Wheeler County and Grant and Harney counties. We're working in the Scott Valley of California. That's really not a Great Basin site, but it is a place that has ranchlands. We're working in Elko County, Nevada, northern Nevada, and we're working in Owyhee County in southwestern Idaho. I'm not going to be talking about the Idaho case today because that's a place where we're still gathering data, but I will be talking about the other sites. So let me tell you a little bit about what's been happening at those sites. The next slide tells you what's been happening in Elko County, Nevada. This has been a very interesting case. The problem that they were trying to address in Elko County was a problem of stream incision and also the problem of needing to restore in-stream habitat for Lahontan cutthroat trout, which were listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened in the early 1990s. And they've also got red band trout in their streams, which are a sensitive species. The project there has been happening primarily on BLM lands. The BLM started finding itself getting sued over critical habitat that it wasn't stewarding properly for these fish species. And so what they decided they needed to do was change up grazing practices on BLM lands. And so what they did was they worked with ranchers to try and control better when the livestock went into the riparian pastures to graze. So basically they got cattle out of the riparian areas during the hot season months. So cattle could go in and graze in riparian areas early in the spring and late in the fall, but during the hot months of like July, August, September, they moved the cattle out of there, and you can see simply by changing up the grazing practices, conditions along, this is a representative creek in this area, it's called Susie Creek. The photo on the left shows you what it looked like in 1989 before they started restoration, and the photo on the right shows you what it looked like 25 years later simply as a result of changing the grazing strategy. Now, as a result of this natural recovery process with the riparian vegetation and so forth, they documented, Trout Unlimited documented that in 1991 there were no beaver dams in this creek, and by 2013 there were 139 beaver dams there. So beaver moved into this area, and they've been doing their work to contribute to restoration ever since. Going to the next slide, this site is in Bridge Creek in Wheeler County in central Oregon. Problem there also was stream incision and a need to recover ESA-listed Columbia River steelhead. And so what they decided on Bridge Creek, which is located again on BLM lands, they decided, well, researchers from NOAA and from a university and from a consulting firm went in and they decided to do an experiment to see how something called Beaver Dam Analogues might do for mimicking the effects of beaver dams and bringing about restoration of this creek. So they went in and they built 114 Beaver Dam Analogues on 35 miles of stream on Bridge Creek. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with what a Beaver Dam analog is, if you look at the photo, you can see a number of posts that are sticking up out of the stream. Basically, you pound posts into the stream bed, and then you weave vegetation through those posts to create an artificial beaver dam-like structure. The goal here is to create habitat that will eventually cause beaver to come back in and take over maintenance of these artificial beaver dams themselves. So the hope then is to, again, to get beavers to recolonize these sites. So that's what's going on at Bridge Creek, and they've been monitoring the effects of these these beaver dam analogs ever since. Going to the next slide. Oh, by the way, at Bridge Creek, there are no cattle there. There is no livestock grazing in that particular area. So cattle grazing is not something they've had to address. Okay, next slide. This is Sylvia's Valley Ranch in eastern Oregon in Grant and Harney counties. It's about 40,000 deeded acres and 100,000 acres of grazing allotments associated with it. What happened in this case was a private landowner bought this property and recognized there was a real problem with stream incision. There was a need for restoration to meet wildlife and ranching objectives that he had. He also really wanted to help recover fish and beaver populations on his property. So he took it upon himself to go out and install 640 rock dams. Some people might also call them check dams, on 18 miles of the Sylvia's River on his property. Now, at the time he did this, he did it without permits. He just went out and did it. And ever since, he's gotten in a little bit of trouble over that. But he's now working with the state of Oregon to try and revised the permitting process around using these structures to restore because he personally has seen a lot of positive restoration impacts from it. But in any event, basically this is using rock and dirt to fill in those deep incised stream channels along the river course and raise up the stream to reconnect it to its floodplain. Okay, the fourth case that I'm going to talk about is California's Scott Valley area. The problem there, also stream incision, but they were particularly motivated to restore in-stream habitat for coho salmon, which are threatened on the Endangered Species Act list. And so here what they've done at the initiative of the local Scott Valley Watershed Council is to go out and install Beaver Dam Analogues on private ranch lands where there are rivers and streams running through there. Now they've only done 5 or 6 Beaver Dam Analog projects to date, but they're looking at doing more this summer, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, well I've described what these projects have entailed. Let's go to the next slide then and start talking about our first question, which is, what are the social impacts of beavers and beaver-related restoration on ranchers who have participated in these projects? Going to the next slide, what we did was first we tried to ask them about what they thought were the benefits of beavers and beaver dams in these areas. Well, I can't tell you the percentage of, who said what, but I'm going to give you the benefits that most people articulated when we talked to them about this. A number of people said they had really helped to improve the stream flows on the places where they grazed. The beaver dams are slowing the stream flows. They reduce spring flooding. They're helping streams to flow later into the summer. A number of streams are retaining water in drought years that didn't do that previously, and streams that were previously ephemeral have now become perennial. And so that has been a real positive impact, and they've also said this is a low-cost restoration approach. Going to the next slide, they said that these beaver dams have really helped to raise the water table, and that has translated into an increase in riparian pastures. So in some places, like if you can look at the photo on the left, you see this is an incised stream channel. You can see sagebrush going right up to the stream bank. But as you raise the stream bank up and you reconnect the creek to its floodplain, you get more grasses and lush vegetation, and that creates better forage for livestock, and it increases hay production. Both of these can have economic benefits to ranchers. In fact, the fellow who's at Sylvia's Valley Ranch said this allows him to grow a lot of hay that he then harvests and sells. Another rancher I talked to in Elko, Nevada said that he no longer grows hay during the summer. He just uses the natural hay that has resulted from this restoration. And so people are definitely getting better quality forage for their livestock in these riparian pastures. Going to the next slide, a number of ranchers also commented on the positive benefits for both fish and wildlife. Ranchers love seeing wildlife around, and they really felt that they'd seen a lot more wildlife come into the area and benefit from this restoration approach. They've also seen fish, particularly because, as I mentioned, some streams dried up during the summer, and now they're continuing to run. That has been good for the fish. Well, going to the next slide, they also articulated drawbacks of beavers and beaver dams. They said, again, a lot of these ranchers are moving their livestock off their private ranches during the summer to the public land so that they can grow hay in the valleys on the ranches for the using in the winter. And a lot of them use flood irrigation, and they said that beavers plug irrigation canals. Sometimes they cause pastures and hayfields to flood. It makes it hard to keep livestock in those pastures. Sometimes the flooding can damage their hay crops. They've experienced beaver dams causing backups of water that will flood roads and cause them to wash out. It can also make it harder for their cattle to cross streams. Going to the next slide, high water flowing around dams, and at least in one case, a rancher really felt that this had caused stream bank erosion on his property, and he had lost a little bit of acreage as a result. Beaver can also kill large trees that people like, such as aspen trees, and people are disappointed when they see those fall over. And then sometimes beaver, create a lot of return of willows in riparian areas, and if you do have livestock out there, they can get lost in the willows, and they can be harder to find. And then a couple of ranchers said, although they really are appreciative of the fact that restoration enhances fish and wildlife habitat, some of them who have private lands that are now, now they've got Columbia spotted frogs or whatever coming back to their property, or even sage-grouse, it sometimes makes them a little bit uncomfortable, like they're happy to be contributing to these sensitive species. But if all of a sudden they have a species on their property that may be a threatened species, they're a little bit worried about what that might mean in terms of now are they going to get regulated about what they can do. Going to the next slide, in sum, really most ranchers said that the benefits of beaver-related restoration outweighed the drawbacks. Here are some of the things that people said. You can have some issues with those beaver as far as moving the channel around and whatnot, but they certainly helped us out on the range. Another person said, there are places that have turned back to wetlands and that we can't graze them. So we've had to give up an acre that is now swamp, but we've gained 6 acres that are good pasture that weren't before. So there's a positive trade-off there. Another person said, my brother was like, oh no, they're going to clog up all the irrigation. We just worked with that. They did clog things up here and there, and I hate to lose trees, but it was strictly about improving our waterways and our wetlands. The enhancement of that frog pond, that was really an eye-opener. You see the real benefit to the other species in the area. So again, I would say that the vast majority of ranchers we spoke with observed both benefits and drawbacks from beavers and their beaver dams or these artificial structures, but almost all of them said that the benefits they saw outweighed the drawbacks. Okay, going to the next slide, and our second research question, what's needed to create an enabling social environment for beaver-related restoration on western rangelands? We identified 7 different things that I will talk about briefly. So the first one, going to the next slide, is low harvest pressure on beavers. It's hard to get beavers to come back to the neighborhood and to take over places where you're trying to promote restoration if people are out busily trapping them. So low harvest pressure on beavers is important, and in fact, in most places, we do see that the harvest pressure on beavers has been declining over the years. This is just a sample of data from California, Beaver Take in California, based on reporting trapped number of animals by the licensed fur trappers. I believe between 2015 and 2016, there were only 26 beavers that were reported to be taken statewide. Basically, this is because of the price of beaver pelts. The price of beaver pelts has been going way down. Now it's about $15 a pelt, so there's not the kind of incentive out there for beaver trapping that there was historically. But some places where they do have trapping, and people have noticed that that's been an impediment to restoration, they have asked for specific interventions to prohibit trapping in those areas where they're trying to do restoration. For example, in the Bridge Creek case, the Prineville BLM District and the Ochoco National Forest asked the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to ban beaver trapping on those lands so that they could promote beaver-related restoration, and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife did that. So you can't have people trapping large number of beavers if you want beaver-related restoration. Going to the next slide. You have to have compatible grazing practices. As one of the BLM employees I talked to mentioned, you've got to get the grazing right to support the beaver. You can put all the beaver and analogs in there you want, but if you've got a grazing problem, it's not going to work. I described what they did in the Elko, Nevada case in terms of improving grazing strategies. Bridge Creek, I mentioned there were no cattle grazing, but in Sylvia's Valley Ranch and also in the Scott Valley, they do have grazing on those lands where they're doing beaver-related restoration. In the Scott Valley, they simply fenced off riparian areas from the cattle, and in Sylvia's Valley Ranch, they're managing the grazing in a way that's compatible with restoration. So you've got to work on the grazing if you want the watershed restoration to work. The next slide. You really have to have leaders and innovators and intermediary organizations who are willing to take on this project and promote it, and that have the patience to both work with the landowners involved or the permittees involved, as well as the regulatory agencies, as well as trying to get funding to do these projects, as well as trying to get scientists to come in with their technical expertise to help implement them. I mean, somebody's got to coordinate all of this. Somebody's got to take the initiative. We found a number of people playing these roles across our different case study sites. These are just some examples I'm showing here. But it's really important to have people that are out there promoting this effort. Going to the next slide, you also have to have landowners who are willing to get involved and try it out. or your permittees on public lands who are willing to go along with the program. As one agency employee said, ironically, there's certainly a lot of progressive ranchers in Elko County. I like to call these people conservation entrepreneurs. They're people that are willing to go out, try new things, and take a risk in order to get some of the potential benefits of these approaches. So the fifth thing that we identified was mitigation techniques for some of the undesirable effects of this restoration approach. I talked about the various drawbacks that ranchers identified that were associated with having beavers and beaver dams on their properties, but there are ways to address some of those problems, and this is a photograph of what you call a beaver deceiver. And it's a fairly low-tech, low-cost structure that can help keep beaver out of your culverts and out of your irrigation channels. And so there are some agencies and organizations that are out there that are trying to promote the use of these kinds of tools to mitigate the negative impacts of this restoration strategy. Going to the next slide. Anytime you want to try something new, you have to be able to experiment, and you have to be able to have research and monitoring accompany those experiments so that you can document what the impacts of those new strategies that you're experimenting with are. And so this has been really important to have that flexibility in the case of promoting beaver-related restoration approaches. In the Nevada case, it was important for the BLM to be able to have the regulatory flexibility to allow permittees to change up their livestock grazing practices. Those range management plans had to allow for that. They're continuing to work with the BLM to promote more innovative grazing and more flexible grazing to allow for riparian recovery in those areas. So the BLM has to be flexible in order to do business differently in a way that can be favorable not only for riparian restoration and stream restoration, but also can be favorable to the livestock permittees who depend on grazing on those lands. In the California case, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife was responsible for issuing permits to allow Beaver Dam Analogues to be installed in streams in the Scott River and its tributaries. And of course, that's a touchy subject when you've got endangered salmon in those water bodies, in those river courses. But they used experimental permits. They worked closely with the implementers to design the project in a way that they would minimize any potential negative impacts on fish. And then the Watershed Council and its partners have been busily monitoring the effects of those Beaver Dam analogues on fish, on the water flows and hydrology, on the riparian vegetation, and on bird species. And so as the data come in, it will be easier to figure out what the appropriate regulatory approach will be. In Oregon, on the Sylvia's Valley Ranch, again, that landowner went in and installed 640 check dams on his property, but now there are a number of researchers, including people from my own team, that are out there studying the effects of those dams on the hydrology of the Sylvia's River and surrounding areas, on the riparian vegetation, and on biodiversity there. So it's important to be able to experiment and to have science to document the outcomes of these experiments. And then going to the next slide, really the seventh thing is that you have to have an enabling regulatory environment that assumes that you've decided that this is in fact a beneficial approach to watershed restoration. But, this has been a bit of a rocky thing for people trying to undertake these projects, particularly where they entail installing in-stream structures, because they're fairly new structures. These are places where we do have ESA-listed fish species and some, amphibians and so on. There's a number of different state and federal agencies that have oversight over this, and they need to figure out how to work together. Often people have to go and get permits from a variety of different agencies. And there are concerns that agencies have that are certainly legitimate. How are they going to affect fish? How are they going to affect other landowners? How are they going to affect water rights? These are complicated issues. Although the permitting process has been somewhat cumbersome, it's improving. And I think this really underscores the importance of science. I think that the more scientific information that comes in about the impacts of beaver-related restoration, the more comfortable the regulatory agencies will be in creating a supportive environment to make it happen. Okay, so wrapping up now, going to the next slide. What are the kinds of products that are going to emerge from our particular social science research related to this effort? Well, we're developing case study reports associated with the 5 different places where we are doing our research. This is an example of what it looks like, and basically we're going to tell the story of what the Watershed Restoration Project has involved in these particular places and what the impacts have been on the ranchers and the landowners in those places, their drawbacks, their benefits, looking to the future, how we can promote these kinds of approaches. And so we're going to post these case studies to the Northwest Climate Hub's website. The Northwest Climate Hub plays an active role in outreach to stakeholders, and by sharing the stories of what have happened in different places, we hope that people can learn from them who are interested in trying these restoration approaches themselves and get more information about how to do it and how to navigate the process and how it might affect the people involved. Of course, we're also going to be writing some journal articles and producing other science products for broader distribution to the public to communicate our findings. But in conclusion, I'm going to the next slide. I'd like to say that, I think environmental restoration and recovery of threatened species is certainly more likely to succeed if the approaches that are used are compatible with the livelihood practices of local stakeholders who are also depending on these natural resources for their livelihoods. They're more likely to succeed when the benefits to the landowners and the land users outweigh the costs. They're more likely to succeed when methods for mitigating the negative impacts associated with restoration approaches on people are available and are used. They're more likely to succeed when there are intermediary organizations that are involved in helping to support the effort. And then they're more likely to succeed when the regulatory environment enables experimentation and innovation to develop effective approaches. I think social science can help in all of these arenas, and I hope I've done a successful job in demonstrating that to you today. So going to the next slide, I'd like to acknowledge my social science collaborators on the research that I presented today, Hannah Gosnell and Rachel DeVee from Oregon State University and Jesse Abrams from the University of Oregon. I'd also like to thank the people who are willing to be interviewed for this project, and I'd like to thank our funders, the Northwest Climate Hub and the Northwest Climate Science Center. And the next slide contains my contact information in case anybody is interested in following up. So thank you very much. That concludes my presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Susan. And we do have a couple questions here already in the chat box. I'm going to go ahead and unmute the lines. We do have some
The conference has been unmuted.
The webinar, and so I'm going to read we have a couple questions already in the chat box, and then we can open up for further conversation as time and interest permit. So question from Malia Volke: where can I find the map or document containing the map Extent of Beaver Restoration Practices 2015? It looks like it's from a paper by Pilliard and Rohde.
Yeah, so David Pilliard and Ashley Rohde are two of our collaborators with the U.S. Geological Survey. So we actually have a journal article that presents the results of the inventory that we've submitted to environmental management, and it's still under review. So I don't have a publication that I can send you yet that contains that, but if you're interested in a copy of the map, I guess this webinar will be submitted, but if you email me your request to the email you see here, I'll contact David and see if he's happy to send you a copy of that map.
Great,
Again,
thank you,
there are
Susan.
some projects that we may need to be added since 2015. Certainly there have been more in-stream structure projects, but I think that's a pretty darn good start for what's out there.
Great, thank you, Susan. Question from David Bailey: are any of the case studies that you looked at in suburban agricultural lands, or is it strictly rural land?
It's strictly rural lands that we have looked to date. I do know that there has been some beaver-related restoration tried in some suburban areas, I think down in the California Bay Area, for example. But ourselves, we have not looked at that because our focus has been on ranchers, and ranchers tend to live in rural areas. Mm-hmm.
Very good. Those are all the questions we have in the chat box. We do have some time left in the webinar before our hour is up. And so I'd like at this point to open it up to folks on the line. If you could just state your name and your affiliation and then your question. We'll be happy to take any questions from folks on the line. Thank you. Any questions for Susan? Well, if there aren't any further questions,
hello?
Sorry. Hello, yes.
Yeah.
Question.
Took a while to get the mute off. Hi, my name's Vicente Sanchez. I'm an entomologist from the Northern Station and doing a detail here in the Washington office. Susan, those artificial structures, or analogues as you call them, are rather interesting. But when you showed the first map, you showed California, and all of the structures were analog. And I was commenting to the person sitting next to me. I don't know her name, but I said, "Gee, there's no beaver in California." And I wonder, are beaver coming back such that analogs won't be necessary, or will there always be a need for analogs, particularly in areas where you just don't have beaver?
Right. So the reason that you only saw the in-stream structures, I think there were 3 on the California map, is that beaver translocation is not legal in California. So, you know, one of the things about all of this is that the laws and regulations vary quite a bit by state. So no beaver translocation in California because it's not legal. That's not to say that there are no beaver there. There are beaver in California, but the Fish and Wildlife Department does not track their population numbers. So that's actually been a bit of a problem. It's hard to know what's going on with beaver populations because generally they're not monitored by state fish and wildlife organizations, in my understanding. The benefit of these artificial or beaver dams, beaver dam analogues, whichever kind of beaver, artificial structures you use, is that oftentimes you do have incised streams, for example, or degraded streams where there isn't sufficient vegetation, or it's too steep of a slope. Like beavers like gradual stream gradients, not steep stream gradients. So if you have incised channels, sometimes it's hard to have the favorable habitat conditions for beaver. So yes, those structures are typically used in places where the natural conditions don't currently support the beaver population from coming in. But the hope is that by beginning the process of restoration, by installing in-stream structures, artificial structures, you'll start creating those favorable habitat conditions that will then draw beaver into the area. And it might be, if you don't have any nearby populations, that you have to translocate them if that's allowed in your state. Or it might be like in the Elko County case. I mean, people said, I don't know where these beaver came from, but they just arrived, So, yeah, that's the idea. Mm-hmm.
We have had a couple of questions come in the chat box. Thank you, Susan. Wanted to follow up from David Bailey. Are state laws regarding beaver relocation, et cetera, being addressed or looked at from a social perspective as a potential hindrance to getting this work done?
So what we are trying to do in the 4 states where we're working is write about what those laws and regulations are so that people that want to do this practice understand clearly what they are. Now, to the extent that they're a hindrance, that's something that we're learning about by talking to the people that have been involved in the projects that we're using in case studies. People may say, oh, this is a hindrance, I can't go out and do the restoration. Well, from the standpoint of the agencies, it's a hindrance because we don't have enough data saying that, wow, this really is going to be good for fish and it's not going to further damage our threatened, species. So I think the more data that we have, the better, the more comfortable the agencies are with opening this up. And in fact, there certainly has been progress. Both in Oregon and California, there are examples of legislation that has tried to make it easier to do this kind of restoration approach. So, yeah, we're trying to help people figure out what the regulatory framework is. We're trying to identify where the problems lie, and that can be used to inform efforts to promote a better supportive regulatory environment. But again, the science is not totally there about this stuff. A lot of data have been generated from this Bridge Creek site in Oregon, but in Scott Valley in California, they say, well, that's from Oregon. We don't really know if it's working the same way here in California. We want our own data. So it's really important for research and monitoring to accompany efforts to try and produce those data.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Question here in the chat box from Frank Postillion. Question about Beaver Dam Analogues. How do they hold up, and are they damaged a lot during large storm events?
Right. So it depends. The ones that are made from rock, those what we call artificial beaver dams, they're a combination of rock and dirt. Those have been holding up pretty well. I can't think of instances, at least from the Sylvia's Valley Ranch, where there have been blowouts. That's not the case with the Beaver Dam Analogues, which are those woven, post and vegetation structures. There have been cases where those have blown out in high floods. Now, natural beaver dams also blow out occasionally, so that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think the desire is to put those in. And if you put in a series of them behind each other, it helps them not to blow out. So it's also a question of how many you put in. This has been a challenge given the regulatory environment because, like for example, Fish and Wildlife might say, well, you can go out and you can put in 2 or 3, but we don't want 50 because we're not fully confident that that won't be bad for fish. Well, if you have 50, you're definitely going to slow down the stream flow a lot more when you get high flows, and it'll be less likely that they'll blow out. So there's sort of a trade-off there. So the answer is yes, sometimes they blow out. The idea is hopefully they won't, and once they attract beaver in, the beaver will do the work of maintaining them, because otherwise, with the Beaver Dam Analogues, before the beaver come back in and do the work themselves, you do have to go back in each year and do some repairs to help them hold. And so there is some ongoing maintenance involved.
Great. Thank you very much. We have an FYI here from Alyssa Farrell, who reports Washington State just passed legislation this session that allows beaver relocation on both sides of the Cascade Mountains, where it's previously only allowed on the east side. So that's an FYI. And then a question here from Mark Nell for Susan. Are the ranchers' fears justified about immigration of threatened and endangered species? And are there exemptions in these cases?
I guess the best answer to that question is I don't know. They do have some concerns about that. It's been, I think, a long-standing concern among private landowners of it's a mixed blessing. You want to try and help threatened species, but if they're on your property, what's it going to mean from a regulatory standpoint? And I guess in this particular case, I think in the case of fish, it's not a real concern because the fish are in the streams. And for example, if you've got fencing along to keep your cattle out of the riparian areas, then people aren't concerned that they're going to be blamed for having negative impacts on endangered fish. But in the case of frogs and sage grouse and that sort of thing, I think the fears are mixed, and I don't personally know how legitimate those concerns are.
Great. Thank you, Susan. We have time for perhaps one more question. We just had one coming in from Conrad Hoffen in the chat box. It says, what evidence exists suggesting beaver dams may be detrimental to fish? Didn't native endangered fish evolve with beaver dams?
Well, exactly. That's what a lot of people will say, that, of course, beaver were historically quite widespread across the West up until the 19th century when extensive trapping nearly extirpated them. These fish have evolved with beaver and beaver dams historically. Nevertheless, I'm simply reporting that there are some state fish and wildlife agencies that are concerned about the potential impacts of these artificial beaver dam-like structures on fish. So in the literature that I've read, the only potential negative impact that I've read about on fish is that if you have beaver ponds that have higher surface, water surface areas or surface area ratios, whatever, sometimes that can increase the temperature in those ponds, and that those increased temperatures may be bad for fish. On the other hand, if they're creating deep pools, that can be a temperature refugia. So I've seen the science on both sides of the argument. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Susan. And we're pretty much at the end of our hour, so I wanted to thank Susan for this outstanding presentation and for introducing our audiences to some of the concepts and the practical applications of social science to this very important habitat and species management topic. Thank you very much for sharing this information with the AFWA audiences. As I did mention, this webinar has been recorded, and we will make the recording available on AFWA's YouTube channel. There'll be a temporary link that goes out after the webinar, but then we will have it available within the next few weeks on AFWA's YouTube channel permanently for you to download and share the link with others. So thank you all very much for being a terrific audience today. I'd like to also thank Susan for all of her work and for sharing this with us. And then for the last word, I'd like to turn it over back to Monica Thomasy at Forest Service.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Susan. That was awesome. Really interesting integration of fish and wildlife and social science. If anyone would like to get more information on Susan's work or on the social science research in the Forest Service, just go to Tree Search, TREESEARCH, and it's a very simple search engine, and you can find out some more of what we're doing in social science for conservation and restoration. The second thing, if anyone listening has a particular natural resource topic of interest to you that you would like us to cover, please send your request to Jonathan, and he sends those over to me, and then I find the speakers, and that's how this one came about. The next one will be on genetic technology, and it will be terminology and principles every natural resource manager should know on genetic technology. That'll be in July. I can't recall the date, but you'll have an announcement from Jonathan pretty soon. So thanks again, Susan and Jonathan, and thanks everybody for participating. Have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thank you very much
for having me.
Yep. Thank you, Susan. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.